Academic standards have been falling in Scottish schools. Why could that be? Let's have a look what's happening in some of those schools. Police called in to patrol Scottish school after unruly behaviour. That's about a year ago at Hoyk High School. There are lots of other schools in Scotland as well where police are routinely stationed on the school campus. This was just in the papers this week. 15-year-old boy has been charged with using a sharpened pencil to stab a teacher in the neck. He was arrested after allegedly attacking the woman teacher in front of shocked students at a secondary school in Scotland on the 25th of September. One parent said over 3 weeks ago a serious incident occurred whereby a male pupil deliberately stabbed a female teacher in the neck with a sharpened pencil which embedded in the left side of her neck. The incident took place in front of other students. As parent of one of these pupils, it is beyond belief that my child may be put at serious risk as this offender can return to school with no consequences. David Farmer, publicity officer with Fife EIS, that's the teachers union, said schools were dealing with physical or verbal violence on a daily basis. Well, there's no such thing as verbal violence, but we know what he means, verbal aggression. The union claimed incidents of violence against teachers were happening with alarming regularity in schools across the region as behaviour in some schools reached crisis point. Worried parents have also expressed fears for their children, who they said were being put at risk. A Scottish teacher writes furious open letter to Nicola Sturgeon. This was just a week or two ago. Just starting reading in the middle. It's fairly common for teachers to be physically assaulted by children whose needs cannot be met due to the inadequate level of funding. It's even more common for our teachers to be verbally abused. These things are happening not because of lack of skills or effort on the part of teachers, nor is it through a lack of support from management, but rather it's through a lack of resources and support from government level. An example of this is with my class last year, where I had to evacuate the children from the classroom on more than one occasion, while one of my children trashed the classroom. I want to emphasise that I am very experienced in dealing with children like this, but despite my experience, I know that it gets to a point where you can use all the strategies you've been taught, and sometimes it just does not work. How about a story from a different teacher in another school about a pupil who just destroyed the school library, throwing chairs around, taking all the books off the shelves, hurling them round, and then their specialist support teacher came along and tried to negotiate with this pupil and calm them down. So this is not unique. Assaults on Scottish teachers fuel £450,000 compensation bills. In the Herald a few weeks ago, a teacher had a kneecap kicked off, another had ribs broken in separate assaults by pupils. New report shows analysis of compensation payments to Scottish school and college staff last year also revealed one teacher was left with injury to the lower back and hip after a flying kick from a pupil. Shock rise in teacher assaults in Scotland's schools. Almost 10,000 teachers were attacked in Scotland's schools over the past 3 years. Shocking new figures reveal. The links are all below for these. More than 1,000 pupils excluded from Glasgow schools. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying these pupils shouldn't have been excluded. I wouldn't want them to have an artificial target, but that is an awful lot. At Holyrood Secondary School, 88 children were told to stay at home after incidents including fighting and substance abuse. Rossall Academy had the second highest exclusion rate, 70 pupils suspended, that's in 1 year, for offences such as fire raising and assault with weapons. Now you could say they're the extremes, that's not representative of what's going on in most schools. But if you think about a normal distribution of behaviour from Scottish pupils, okay, that's the extreme. But with those numbers in the absolute extremes, think about the vast numbers that will just be generally disobedient, disrespectful, causing mayhem in lessons, disrupting learning left, right and centre. Setting a bad example and lowering the overall standard in the school and reducing the expectations that teachers can insist on because the other pupils see pupils getting away with doing less. So this is a particular problem at the moment, discipline in schools. But why at the moment? People offer all sorts of theories. Poverty, inequality, social media, computer games, too much sugar, lack of job opportunities, lack of role models, windy weather outside. All those, I don't really buy them. But I think there are some factors that are definitely influencing a deterioration of behaviour in schools. Number one, a general undermining of authority in society. Young people are taught more to say, I know my rights, you can't tell me what to do, pupils and teachers are equal. Instead of, okay, because of your position of valid authority, I ought to do what you say. They just don't get that message. Broken homes, in particular absent fathers, I mean, sadly, if you look at crime statistics, for example, it's a huge factor in the emotional and character development of children, boys in particular. Number 3, I think weak and indulgent parenting is rife. I think lots of children go to school and they haven't actually learned that no means no. They think that no means you've got 6 more chances before something very mild might happen if you're unlucky. Number 4, a lot of thinkers talk about generation daycare, and they suggest that infants who spend a lot of hours in daycare have emotional and developmental problems, particularly to do with their behaviour and aggression. It's also suggested by some writers that parents who put their children in daycare for very long hours might feel a bit guilty about that, then might be a little indulgent with their kids when they see them. So really the odds are stacked against the teachers. So how do schools respond to that? How does the education system respond? Well, it responds by implementing a weak and indulgent disciplinary system in the schools. Now in Scotland, they've got a special name for a weak and indulgent disciplinary system. It's called restorative practice. Now, restorative practice is based on 2 fundamental principles. The first one is punishment bad. Punishing children is ineffective, it's harmful, it's counterproductive. Principle number 2, counselling is good. Talk things through with kids, the kids will realise the error of their ways, reform, and then they will behave themselves. So for example, when a boy's battered another child and left them curled up on the floor in tears, the reason they did that is because they didn't realise it was having such a negative effect on him. And once they understand that the other child doesn't like being beaten up and left in tears, the negative behaviour will stop. Or alternatively, when a boy mocks and ridicules a teacher in front of the class, the real problem is that they don't understand, they don't realise that the teacher doesn't really like it. If you talk it through, the teacher and the pupil can make friends again and all will be well. There's no need for punishment. This is obviously a utopian and unrealistic view of human nature, but it's taken for granted in the Scottish educational establishment. Now don't get me wrong, talking about these issues, counselling even, can be useful and productive. In my days as a teacher, particularly when I was a housemaster, I spent hours and hours talking to boys, particularly if they were having some sort of problems, if they were misbehaving. Sometimes it was fruitful, it led to progress, sometimes it wasn't so fruitful. But punishment is also important as well. There's such a thing as badness. Some pupils know exactly what they're doing, and they're doing it out of vindictiveness or some sort of perverse pleasure in inflicting pain or embarrassment on people. Now with the restorative approach, the children basically learn that you can always get away with something for the first time, because the first time you do something, it will always be this little chat and nothing more. So when a teacher goes into a new class, if a boy, for example, is very insolent and cheeky to the teacher, whereas the teacher might want to just be able to nip that in the bud, instantly give a punishment, just say, I'm not having that, end of story, there's a punishment, learn your lesson. And the rest of the class think, oh right, okay, he means business, we better not do that. But with the restorative thing, it's all dealt with behind the scenes, it's just a chat, it seems to the others as if nothing's really happened. But then you have this pathetic, contrived mini counselling session, pretending that the boy didn't understand what he was doing wrong. Then he says he won't do it again, knowing full well that he actually will. Now the illustrations I've given you there are one thing, but listen to this quote again from the EIS representative. And again, he's speaking following the incident of the teacher being stabbed in the neck by a pupil with a pencil. He said, I can think of teachers who've been kicked, spat on and beaten by kids who do know what they're doing. Mr. Farmer said the EIS supported restorative practices where if a child behaved violently towards a teacher, dialogue would be opened up between them to restore the situation. So if a pupil punches a teacher, the response should be that the teacher and the pupil sit down and discuss it in order to restore their relationship, in order to make friends again and smooth things over. You can see the way pupils will see this as just a total joke. It's a lame, pathetic and weak disciplinary response, but this is what's been pushed by Education Scotland on behalf of the Scottish Government. And if schools don't like it, well, that's tough for the schools, but he called for consequences for pupils for whom this did not work. So if they've punched a teacher once or twice, they've tried to sit down and make friends again, but it hasn't really worked and they're still punching teachers. Maybe at that stage there might need to be some sort of punishment or suspension or whatever. We're not convinced that in some schools this actually happens. So he thinks that in some schools it never happens. There's never any sort of consequence for violence towards teachers. I mean, it's laughable and it's so ridiculous. Anyone with any common sense can look at this and think something's far, far wrong here. And yet within the Scottish educational establishment, this seems to be taken for granted. Now, the restorative practice, part of the problem is the detail of policies, but the more fundamental problem is the ethos that it promotes. Is this basic idea, punishment bad? The pupils are all basically good. If they're not behaving well, it's because they've been misunderstood. They're just having a bad day. There's various emotional factors they don't really understand. Now, all those factors are possible, but it's completely out of balance. They've lost all conception of rebelliousness, vindictiveness, of kids knowingly doing things wrong for fun, for gratification. Now, when I'm driving my car, I tend to more or less stick to the speed limit pretty well. And the reason I do that is not because I'm very responsible and safety conscious, it's because I'm worried about getting caught. Okay, that keeps my speed down, and that's fair enough. But in Scottish education, the assumption is the kids are all on a higher plane than me. They don't need fear of punishment in order to keep them on the straight and narrow. They can think it all through for themselves. Now, people do say that if a pupil behave themselves just because they're worried about a punishment, well, that's not a very good reason. That's not really moral progress with that pupil. Well, maybe not in a sense, but if they're behaving themselves out of fear for punishment, at least the class can get on and do some work. At least the school can be a civilized place. But a lot of virtues are habits. If someone behaves themselves because they're worried about what will happen if they don't, that can give them the space to develop a good character. But good character, do you hear much about that in Scottish education? Not very much at all. It's all about care for these delicate flowers in need of protection. After this stabbing incident, one of the local council education officials said our schools have a range of measures and procedures in place to support the well-being of all. So what we're dealing with here is a gross disciplinary issue, and he responds by talking about measures to support well-being. That's the general culture. Discipline is not understood at all. It's not focused on. The focus is all on well-being. Now, if young people don't learn obedience, how are they going to manage in a job? If they can't learn to treat people with civility, how are they going to cope in their relationships in the future? Things are not looking good. But the response to these problems, the response to deteriorating behaviour in Scottish schools, it's always the same thing. We need to teach them more about their human rights, which is counterproductive. The idea that pupils and teachers are equal or more equal undermines teachers' authority, leads to greater problems. There's always more emphasis on pupil voice. When the police were called into Hoyk High School, one of the measures taken there was to improve the pupil council, so pupil voice could be heard. Listening to pupils, all well and good, but it can be counterproductive if it implies the tacit message that the school exists to do what you want. So if a teacher's asking you to do or telling you to do something that you don't want to do, then something must be wrong. The other solution that's often proposed, we heard about it in the open letter, we need more people. We just need reinforcements. The pupils are so unruly, so difficult, we just need more and more adults in the classroom to be able to quell the potential riot. The problem with that, it's unsustainable. You can't just keep paying more and more salaries to deal with disciplinary problems. One of the teaching unions actually suggests that teachers should patrol during break time or lunchtime in pairs for their own safety. Now, if teachers have been advised to go around school in pairs, how are the pupils going to be in that school? Are they safe walking around on their own if a teacher doesn't feel safe on their own? I mean, it's crazy. And then the other thing, the main means of countering this poor behaviour is restorative practice, which, as I've explained, I think is counterproductive. In Scottish education, it's a one-way street. The advice is the direction to go is always in the more progressive so-called direction. So if things get worse when you go in a more progressive direction, the solution is to go yet further in a progressive direction. If things get worse still, then the reason for that is you still haven't gone far enough in a progressive direction. You need to go even further. It always reminds me of this.
I think you're in luck, though. An extraordinary new cure has just been developed for exactly this kind of sordid problem.
It wouldn't have anything to do with leeches, would it?
I had no idea you were a medical man.
I've never had anything you doctors didn't try to cure with leeches.
You know, the leech comes to us on the highest authority.
Yes, I'd heard that. Dr. Hoffman of Stuttgart, isn't it?
That's right, the great Hoffman.
Owner of the largest leech farm in Europe.
Yes. Well, I can't spend all day gossiping. I'm a busy man. As far as this case is concerned, I've now had time to think it over, and I can strongly recommend a course of leeches.
So to conclude, there are serious behaviour problems in Scottish schools, and it's getting worse. Education Scotland is pouring petrol on the fire by enforcing woefully unbalanced, weak and indulgent approaches to discipline. I'm going to be making another video on restorative practice soon, going into it in a little bit more depth, including looking at the research that allegedly supports it. Do subscribe if you're interested in this sort of content, and thanks for watching.